This is theBreaker.news podcast for the week of April 26th, 2026. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 445. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, a special edition, Expo 86, 40 years later. The World's Fair on Transportation and Communication began May 2nd, 1986 in Vancouver. My guest is Andy Yan, the director of the City Program at Simon Fraser University. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast.
British Columbia.
Come and join us!
Vancouver and Expo 86, an incredible display of world achievements, entertainment, and culture as Canada hosts the world.
As Premier of British Columbia, I'm personally inviting all Canadians to join us in this national celebration.
Expo 86, Vancouver. Don't miss it for the world.
The gates opened for the $1.6 billion Expo 86 on May 2nd, 1986 in False Creek, and at the new Canada Place on Cole Harbour. It ran until October 13th, 1986. They counted more than 22 million turnstile clicks at the gates. Prince Charles and Princess Diana opened the fair at BC Place Stadium on May 2nd, 1986, and they also appeared the next night at a Gala Expo Theatre concert with Kenny Rogers, Sheena Easton, and hometown acts Loverboy and Bryan Adams. It all started over drinks in London in 1978. That's where BC Social Credit Cabinet Minister Grace McCarthy told Canadian diplomat Patrick Reed that she wanted to bring the Mona Lisa to Vancouver to keep up with Seattle, which brought the treasures of King Tut. Reed, however, was also with the Bureau of International Expositions, and he suggested BC bid on a World's Fair instead. Fast forward to November 26, 1980, when Vancouver was awarded Transpo 86, later renamed Expo 86. The theme was World in Motion, World in Touch. There were 47 international pavilions. There were 9 for the provinces and territories, 6 corporate, and 3 state pavilions. Also on the site, the Great Hall of Ramses II, a replica of the Egyptian temple and treasures from his tomb. The RCMP musical ride performed. The Roundhouse, Vancouver's oldest industrial building, was restored for Expo, and it was the new home of historic engine number 374. SkyTrain was new, and it acted as a shuttle between the main False Creek site and Canada Pavilion at Canada Place. There was a monorail, and also a gondola system, mini ferries on False Creek to get around. To get information, there was the IBM touchscreen information kiosks, the Canadian precursor to the World Wide Web called Teledon, and a localized radio station. All that for a one-day ticket which cost $20 or $160 for a season pass. It was truly a summer to remember, especially for me. I had a column in the Creek newspaper. I was 15 years old, going on 16, and the youngest accredited reporter at Expo 86. No more of that image of parka-clad igloo dwellers that so much of the world perceived Canadians to be. It was really a coming-out party for the country. But not everybody could join in the party. On May 2nd, 1986, the province newspaper reported under the headline, "Poor have no reason for Expo smiles." The story said that while better off Vancouverites got set to have an Expo ball, the city's poor were caught between a rock and a hard place. Tenants were being evicted, families were fighting over dingy basement suites, and welfare moms could not afford anywhere to rent. So here we are on the Breaker.news podcast looking back to Expo 86 40 years ago. May 2nd, 1986 is when it opened. Andy Yan, the Duke of Data, the director of the city program at Simon Fraser University, is here with me. We're here on Granville Island and we're looking east through Falls Creek at a very different place than it was on May 2nd, 1986, a very different city than it was May 2nd, 1986. First of all, Andy, do you remember where you were on May 2nd, 1986?
Where I was in grade 5. I was 11 years old, so I was the precocious age of 11 in Hastings Elementary. So that kind of culminates my kind of start of my my soon-to-be adolescence, and kind of how I grew and got to learn more about Vancouver.
You went to Expo 86 as a youngster, 11-year-old here in Vancouver. Remember the first time you actually went to the fair?
Yes, very much so. And I mean, it was this kind of incredible experience, as you can imagine, being an 11-year-old, of really all these sights and scenes that you haven't experienced in one short life. But yet at the same time, it kind of felt like the world really did come to Vancouver, and really how it was very much a kind of opening of the city to an entire global audience.
Now, it's a city that grew out of the fairgrounds on the north side of Falls Creek. 2 sites. There was the north side of Falls Creek. There was also Canada Place on Cole Harbour, and Cole Harbour grew around Canada Place, really. Industrial sites that became temporary fairgrounds, which became residential sites. One big issue on the way to the fair, of course, was the toxic soils. And after the fair was the sale of the land offshore to Li Ka-shing and his Concord Pacific. What does the fair and the fairgrounds represent to you as someone who is an expert in urban planning?
I think it's interesting, because in one way it represents many things all at once. That a lot of this really talks about the emergence of Vancouver as this struggling industrial city to this kind of emerging global metropolis. But I think within that kind of global metropolis is really how residential real estate in particular in the city became a global commodity. That I think the story of Vancouver is really one of how its residential real estate began to enter the global marketplace for residential real estate, and really how that changed the city in terms of its economy and really what it meant for its local residents, as it, I think, was really a moment of incredible fortune and wealth for some, but for others, it's really been, I think, decades of struggle in terms of trying to find a place of secure housing.
Speaking of secure housing and struggle, it was that way in 1986 for residents, especially of the downtown east side, which living conditions were relatively better then, still not optimum. One of the residents there was Olaf Solheim. What is the story of Olaf Solheim?
Well, Olaf Solheim was an 88-year-old former logger who was living in the Hotel Patricia, who, after 30 years of living in the Hotel Patricia, was evicted. And as part of that eviction and relocation process, ultimately died. And it's actually, I think, a important moment, because it's where the chief medical health officer, John Blatterwick, at the time had declared that as part of the death of Olaf Solheim, that one key element of his death was actually the loss of his housing. That the direct quote is, he died of a broken heart. And it's, I think, covers really the kind of current discussions around how housing is a right, and there are dire consequences when one loses housing. And I think that it's also how, within this conversation of Expo, we really see the emergence of how housing has become, and I mean, it was always been an issue, but it, I think, really escalates after Expo in terms of the deep concerns around affordable housing, particularly housing for those on local incomes.
Yeah, this was such a great celebration. That was a great tourist draw. It got Vancouver's brand out there in the world, but it didn't cater to everyone. There were people that, as you say, were struggling. Olaf Solheim was one of them. I look back at the May 2nd, 1986 edition of the Vancouver Province.
Right.
It had stories of a single mother that was struggling to find affordable housing. She's struggling to work here in Vancouver.
Yep.
And we look at present day and see all around us the struggles that people are living on sidewalks, living in cars. But this isn't new.
It isn't new. But then I think what is new are the depths through which I think you see people really struggle in terms of their housing as well as deep poverty. One interesting aspect about Olaf, and it's also important to kind of note that in the following kind of studies of Expo of really how many people got evicted during Expo, estimates have gone up to about 1,000 people, and it covered a very particular demographic in terms of older men who got evicted from their hotels, but then from the single resident occupant hotels. But it's also interesting to kind of see that at the same time you actually see Vancouver's first homeless count. And in Vancouver's first homeless count, it came up to about, the numbers kind of fluctuate a little bit, but it's about 60 homeless people that were counted in that first homeless count in 1986. And I think you flash forward today, within the city of Vancouver, you'll see a homeless population of almost 2,600. So I think it really talks to how Expo, I think, is a point in time through which you can measure how Vancouver has changed for the better or for the worse.
The twin themes of Expo 86 were world in motion, world in touch, man in motion, man in touch. It was about transportation and communication. And back then, it was the pre-internet era. The internet was really in its infancy for university researchers and scientists. As for transportation, what was new back then was SkyTrain, and SkyTrain really revolutionized Vancouver.
And you got to also remember, Expo 86 wasn't originally called Expo 86. The intention was actually to call it Transpo 86. So it kind of highlights how important it saw the role of transportation and also telecommunications, as it's kind of remarkable in terms of looking at the documents of the time to kind of see what it was intending to do towards kind of providing a platform for to not only talk about what's happening in Vancouver, but it also being a platform for Canadian technology. And I think that this is also where it's not only, say, the actions within the city of Vancouver, but the provincial government. You actually see really deep interest and activity from the provincial government towards making Expo 86 happen. And I think that that's also a kind of interesting note to kind of see this mega event not only being driven by, say, those at the local scale, but certainly at the provincial scale. And I think that it's also important to kind of note really the almost dire economic state that the province of British Columbia was at. I just looked it up, and you were talking about in 1986 provincial unemployment rate of almost 11%. And I think that really kind of highlights again how it wasn't only the city, but it was actually the province of British Columbia that was really struggling in the midst of some pretty sizable industrial changes around the world, and particularly in the province of British Columbia, and really what that meant towards the kind of urgency towards having an event like Expo.
Seattle also had an interesting history. It was a former World's Fair host city, 1962. And that wasn't the only World's Fair in recent years in the Northwest. There was also one in Spokane. Right. And Canadians also remember the biggest celebration of the 1967 centennial year in Montreal, Montreal's Expo 67. Which city do you think handled the fair better and use the legacy better to its advantage?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because at that time, success wasn't guaranteed, because what you also had was the World Expo in New Orleans in 1984. and that kind of ended up to be a pretty big dud. So it's a really kind of interesting question to kind of look at who had the biggest legacy. I think that when we think about that, I think that you mind you, at the same time, you think about really the significant difference in terms of the economic footprint that Vancouver has versus, say, Seattle. And I think that it's really clear that in Seattle, it really, I think, ended up to be, I think, a significant jumping off point. And I mean, people still celebrate, I think, the World Exposition in Seattle fondly. And even if some of them may not have been even born back then, it covers really, I think, how much people saw that as a moment of change for the city of Seattle. But then I think when we talk about Vancouver, I think that in one way, if you will, the jury's still out. That I think in one way, yes, we see this redevelopment around us in this particular shot. But yet, I think it's more talking about not only the hardware but also the software of, I think, some ongoing profound economic challenges in a place like the city of Vancouver, as well as Metro Vancouver in general, in terms of just how dependent the city has become on residential real estate development, and yet at the same time is still missing some sizable, I think, diversification in terms of its economic well-being. And I think that this is really something that I think the city has really struggled for. When you just simply look at, say, incomes across regions in North America, the top is really, you know, you can imagine San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but you look at Vancouver, it's not that great. It kind of spans, I think I did one calculation, it's when you look at all metropolitan areas in North America, you're talking about number 120. And I think that really kind of highlights the ongoing challenge of economic development in metropolitan Vancouver and the city of Vancouver, as opposed to just physical development.
At Expo 86, it was also a very interesting time in world history that among the pavilions, the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union didn't exist into the 1990s. We had China before China boomed, before China got into the World Trade Organization and became a big player in the 21st century. But we also had Canada in its own pavilion off this site. This was also a real turning point for Canada in the world. In many ways, Canadians look back and say, where did the momentum go?
Right. And that's an interesting observation in terms of where the momentum, I think that to a certain degree it covered how Canada saw itself as really, you're talking, well, I mean, 86, you're still talking about the Cold War, and it's just about, you know, I think it's by 92 it's done, but then I think it goes into, I think, some ongoing, I think, issues and concerns for all Canadians in terms of not only housing affordability, but about economic development, about our dependency upon natural resources, and how do we go and develop those resources, how we move away from just shipping raw resources out into something that's by far more sophisticated economy. But yet those are issues that certainly, I think, 1986 kind of presents a moment to kind of mark a measure, but yet I think we still see the ongoing struggles.
Speaking of the Cold War back in 1986, that biggest news story internationally at the time, outside of Vancouver, was the meltdown at the Chernobyl nuclear plant in Kyiv in Ukraine, which at the time was a state of the Soviet Union. Compare those days with these days when it comes to the geopolitical strife. You know, as you said, the Cold War was still on. We don't have the Cold War now, but we've got different polarity. We've got the American empire declining, and we've got the BRICS countries rising economically and militarily.
Well, I think that's a really, again, another element to kind of being into this conversation. You have to remember that Vancouver was one of the early participants of the Sister City program, and amidst the first cities that Vancouver became a sister to was Odessa. So it kind of really was in a very early on kind of relationship with what's happening in the Ukraine, with really the relationships we have here in Canada, much less Vancouver. So I think that it's an interesting time, because in 1986 you could imagine that the relationships with the U.S. between Canada and the United States was almost inseparable. You can imagine those images of Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney singing Irish Eyes I think what's this? Singing. I think they sang Irish Eyes together, from my understanding. But it really, I think, talks to really how the world has changed. And I mean, one can't really imagine Mark Carney singing any song with Donald Trump, although that would be interesting. But I think that it's really, I think, those moments, and again, how we changed, because I think it's also a time through which we didn't necessarily have the income polarities that I think that this is also, I think, an important element to kind of talk about the income inequalities, the really, I think, the forces that are, I think, breaking apart a lot of liberal democracies. I think, interestingly enough, saw their beginnings in 1986 in terms of the kind of beginning of neoliberalism and the growth of neoliberal politics and policies and economics, and really how we've been in that experiment in almost 40 years, and what those outcomes are and where we are now today.
Ronald Reagan didn't come to Expo 86, but George Bush, as vice president, did. He was one of the international dignitaries that came to the site in Falls Creek. May 2nd, 1986, it opened famously with Prince Charles and Princess Diana on a yacht here in Falls Creek.
Indeed.
That took them along into Falls Creek, to the Plaza of Nations. They were also on the SkyTrain. They were also on the monorail. So we saw various eclectic items on the site that weren't all about transportation and communication. What was your favorite part of Expo 86? What attraction did you try to come back to every time you came back to the site?
Oh, it's one of those things that, I think as you get older, you have different reference points to your memories. And for me, and I mean, maybe it's because I'm now an urban planner, that there was this almost sculptural Highway 86. I don't know if you remember that, Bob, but it was really these various modes of transportation laid out in a highway, they called it, in terms of just kind of experiencing how people get around. And it was certainly, I think, one exhibit that kind of really, I think, made an impression on me. But I think what was also neat was also the the gondolas. That there was this kind of really neat gondola system that was one way of getting around the fair, and one was able to kind of take the gondola and kind of have this great ride around the large parts of the fairgrounds. And I think that all kind of put in, I think, a certain, impression of really the possibilities that were the future, I think, from an 11-year-old kid in 1986, that I wonder if you talk to 11-year-olds today, what they might say.
Do you think that mega events, as much as they made the city more interesting and brought people here, were they a drawback?
Well, I think that, it's interesting because of how mega events kind of cover a kind of Canadian political economy, that being out here in the West, that we need these events seemingly to get the kind of attention of the federal government, and sometimes even the attention of the provincial government, to invest in these cities. And really, and I think that this is more definitely in Expo, and to a certain degree within, to a limited degree within the Olympics, that you had really the sizable investment in infrastructure. I think about the role of, say, SkyTrain, and I think it's interesting to kind of note that while I mentioned that the population has grown sizably in the city of Vancouver since 1986, the really large growth was actually in the region, and how something like SkyTrain became a catalyst, but yet also a way to avoid the kind of even worse traffic, is perhaps one benefit coming out of these mega events, but then I think it's really the unsustainability, the kind of almost the inability to have sustained economic investment and infrastructure investment that I think is really an ongoing challenge for the city of Vancouver and Metro Vancouver in general. And I think that this is really also another note is to see the amount of careers, certainly in the one that I worked with in the architectural life of the city, that Expo 86 launched a lot of architectural careers in Vancouver that became global players in terms of architecture and the celebration of how we build cities. But then I think you fast forward to 2010, that type of, if you will, investment of that next generation didn't necessarily happen. And I think that really, I think, is a lost opportunity, and it really kind of marks the changes of these mega events, as these mega events, while certainly Expo had a kind of corporate element to it, but the kind of complete and total corporatization of things like the Olympics, no surprise, really, I think, talks to actually the limited impact it has towards having a deep legacy in the city. Although one should note, of course, that with the Olympics, it certainly had the Canada line in terms of having that link between the airport, the subway line between the airport and downtown Vancouver. But yet, I think in terms of sustained economic growth and development, I think it still is challenging in a place like Vancouver.
And one more topic. What is your favorite piece of Expo 86 that still exists 40 years after? And what do you miss about Expo 86? What piece of Expo 86 that is no longer with us do you miss? So what is your favorite element, favorite legacy, tangible legacy, and what do you miss the most?
Favorite tangible legacy. I think my favorite tangible legacy, I think certainly one can talk about, say, Science World and how it kind of presented a kind of, icon, a physical icon. But I think actually, the legacy was a kind of unique pathway, a system of walking and biking that you can do throughout the city now, and particularly around Falls Creek, that I think that it became actually the catalyst towards a set of public goods. And I think that that's really one of the kind of neat legacies to kind of talk about really the net group of amenities that actually had come in because of Expo. And I think, maybe a helicopter pad or two, but I think that there is actually a set of public goods in terms of parks, in terms of pathways, that actually is a neat legacy. But towards an element that I'm missing since Expo, I hate to say it, but I mean, one thing that I find concerning is that sense of optimism. If you kind of look at the documents and look at the plans of the time that I've been able to dug up and the plans that came after Expo, there was this moment of optimism, this kind of sense of of an idea that the future is brighter. And I think it's interesting going into some of the plans in the that were created after that time, that there was a commitment towards 20% of the development on the North Shore of Falls Creek being towards non-market social housing. I don't know whether that really has happened. That really perhaps is an opportunity to look at. But I think that there was this sense of how the horizons were endless, that I wonder if many people feel that horizons are that endless, but then perhaps feel that they're closing in. And I think that that's really something I will miss from Expo, and we need to perhaps help open them again.
Well, thanks again to Andy Yan, the director of the city program at Simon Fraser University, the Duke of Data, looking back at Expo 86, 40 years on. May 2nd, 2026 is the 40th anniversary of the opening of Expo 86. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of April 26th, 2026. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 2nd of May in 1986, it was the 316th anniversary of King Charles II signing the Hudson's Bay Charter? The Hudson's Bay Company lasted 355 years until 2025, when the last Bay store closed. Now you know. Send me your feedback, send me your story ideas to Bob at theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca and bobmackin.substack.com. Sign up for the free email newsletter and get updates to your inbox, or follow The Breaker News for news as it happens on X, formerly Twitter. And you can support The Breaker for as little as $7 a month. For more information, go to bobmackin.substack.com. Until next week.